Welcome to Show Studio.
Thank you.
We're going to talk. Oh, thank you. Thank you for being here. You're a very busy man because Dior and I has just come out. It's kind of everywhere in cinemas. Everyone's obsessed with it. It's amazing. It moved me to tears, very embarrassingly. But what I want to ask you is to go back a little bit and not talk about how you started working with Raf, but talk a little bit before, because you've been interviewed before about the project and you said something that really touched me. You said you have to fall in love with the world you're portraying. So tell me, how did you fall in love with fashion?
Oh, that's a long story. I mean, it goes back to when I finished film school. You know, I moved to New York to go to film school, and I really thought I was going to make narrative film. You know, that was kind of like my big dream. And then at the end of film school, I was a little bit stuck. You know, I had a little bit of the writer's block because I was supposed to write my thesis, and I was like, wow, there's so much responsibility just creating a whole world and just like, you know, being responsible for that world, and you're the author. And then my friend Matt Cap called me and he was like, oh, we're shooting a documentary about Valentino, the Italian designer. Since you're French, the first shoot is going to be in France, so would you want to join? And that's how I fell into documentary. I mean, I fell into documentary filmmaking before I fell into fashion, basically. You know, I didn't really know that much about Valentino or the fashion world, and it was kind of a revelation. And you know, suddenly we're in Valentino's castle, sort of like running after him, and he's, you know, dozens of servants. Yeah. And I was like, wow, this is so much fun. It's like the world is in front of you. You could just take it in, and it suited my personality much more. You know, I'm much more of a contemplative person, and that's how I fell in love with documentary. And then, you know, we spent a lot of time following Valentino, almost 2 years. So I got an extensive sort of crash course in fashion through the eyes of Valentino, and that was really interesting. I mean, you know, the last couple of years of Valentino's career were very flamboyant. I mean, it was kind of the end of an era. So
absolutely.
I was like, wow, fashion is you can't, as a documentary filmmaker, you can't ask for more. You have, you know, multi-million-dollar sets and
an amazing cast of characters.
Amazing cast of characters, and so I really got hooked on this world. And of course, when the film was released, you know, it was pretty successful in the U.S. And even though I wasn't the director, you know, I still got approached by several people, including Lisa Mortino-Vreeland. And so I was kind of careful not to. I knew that I was going to be cataloged as a fashion filmmaker, and that's not necessarily something that I wanted, you know, because, as I said, like, I wanted to be a narrative filmmaker to begin with. It was not part of a plan at all, and I knew that it could be restrictive in the long term. But when Lisa told me about Diana Vreeland, you know, I didn't know that much about her, to be honest. But as soon as I read the book, it was like I fell in love with Diana Vreeland. I was like, there's no way I can say no. This is an amazing story, and this could be a really great adventure. And then, you know, 2 years after that, at a screening of Diana Vreeland, I met Olivier Bialobos at Dior, who was interested in collaborating to document the arrival of a new designer. And so, you know, I knew that Dior being French is such a part of our culture. You know, it's such a legendary house, at the same time completely mysterious because no camera has really been inside.
Absolutely, yeah.
And of course it spoke to me immediately, and then when I heard that it was Raf who had been announced, I sort of again fell in love, and there was no way I could say no, because everything I had read about him, everything I knew about him, just made me want to do it.
I can imagine. It's interesting you said there, and you talked about this notion of perhaps getting pigeonholed as being someone who makes sort of films about fashion, and that's one thing that interests me with all of your work, but specifically with the Dior documentary, because it doesn't strike me, obviously it is about fashion, it follows Raf putting together that very first couture collection that he did for the House of Dior in 2012, but it's not really a film about fashion, it's more about relationships and emotions. That's what it struck me as being about, and it's very much, that's what I got really invested in, and lots of different people's narratives and their emotional journeys, and Is that something that you enjoy sort of cataloguing? That must have been a very exciting thing, because putting together a collection is like emotional turmoil, isn't it?
Right. Well, I think, I guess I just, I was drawn instinctively to the things that I can relate to, and, the sort of glamorous sort of red carpet side of fashion, I don't really know that well, and that's not necessarily something that I follow.
Absolutely.
But the creative process, that's something that I experience every day, I'm sure that you experience it every day, like everyone who works in a creative field, you have to create and then present your project and collaborate with other people, and it's not always easy, but it's very emotional.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, it came pretty naturally to me to speak about what resonated with me, what sort of made my heart beat a little bit, like, it's interesting, Peter Mullier, who's Raf's right hand, when I interviewed him for the film, he said, you do your research, you do your homework, and you have your concepts pretty prepared, but then once you start the fittings, you have to let your instincts take over.
Sure.
And he said you have to be very responsive to when your heart beats a little faster.
Yeah.
And that's exactly how I felt. He put words onto like something that I really had felt, and I that's what I tried to do on that film. When you're behind your camera, you just you try to point it to the place that you feel most passionate about, and that you feel like something's happening for you inside. So
it was interesting because some of my favourite moments in the film, they're not perhaps, it's interesting that you talk about that kind of red carpet glamour, because they're not perhaps the most glamorous moments, they're the very human moments. I don't want to ruin the film for people that haven't seen it, but there's that wonderful scene in the elevator where they're kind of stuck and they're late to a fitting, and it's a very human moment, and it's with people who aren't the stars or the face of fashion. They're very much behind the scenes, and that must have been a real privilege to tell people's story who perhaps their story hasn't been told. The stars are kind of Florence and Monique. They really come to shine, who are the head of the two different facets of the atelier. So the tailoring on one hand, and then the kind of the flue and the ball gowns on the other side, and they really come to shine. But they're quite shy. I imagine they're quite nervous about having their story told, because they are so behind the scenes, very proud of what they do.
No, they're not really self-conscious. They're shy, like any person who's not used to being in front of camera. They're not really used to be solicited that much. But they are filmed sometimes for French television, but it's a very different setup. Usually, the camera crews come for a very short period of time, and they sort of don't really talk to them. They sort of film what they know they already want to get, and we had a very different approach. We tried to arrive like as early as possible. 8 a.m. when they arrive, and the first few days were basically just me and my sound man or my cameraman going from table to table and talking to each person, asking their name, asking a little bit of their story, trying to establish a rapport so that we would, because we only had 8 weeks, so I really wanted to get to the heart of how they felt, and you have to. So we really went literally from one table to the next and asking.
Which Raf himself does in the film, which is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it must have been really great timing, in a sense, going in as a new designer went in, because you must have almost became a part of that big process of change. I imagine trying to film at a different time would have been quite tricky, because you really would have felt like a stranger. But
totally.
It was all upheaval anyway. So.
Yeah, exactly. Everything was changing, so the cameras, I think, were just
another part.
Yeah,
I can imagine. It's interesting because I read, and correct me if this is wrong, I read an interview before that Raf initially said no when you did approach him, because he's incredibly private as a designer.
Yeah.
What changed his mind?
I don't know. I don't really like to speak for himself, but for him. But he agreed to 1 week after I sent him a little letter, which explained sort of what I was interested in.
What did you say in the
film.
letter?
Well, I said that I was interested in the encounter between the past and the future, and the past being the tradition of the atelier, and I was interested in his encounter with the atelier and how those two different cultures. You know, he's a young designer from Antwerp who's very future driven, and then the atelier are mostly about, you know, people who've worked there for like decades and decades, and it's all about tradition. And so these two cultures kind of like collided, you know, when Raf enters at Dior. And so that's how I presented the project to him, and he invited me for a week. He said he wasn't committing, you know, to anything, but it was kind of a trial period, I guess. And then we got to know each other, and I think it all happened on a human level. You know, once he could put a face on who I was, and he asked me like thousands of questions about, you know, what my favorite films were, favorite directors, and everything. And once he could understand a little bit, he could get a connection, you know, a human connection. I think for him it was much easier to be filmed. So that's how it happened. I think it's, you know, in the abstract, he has he's guarding in, you know, his privacy, but in reality, he's a human being, I think. So he just understands things on a, you know, on a human level. You know, if he trusts you, then he opens the door.
It's interesting talking about that kind of human level, because I think one thing that obviously the story is about Raf and it's about Dior, but it's also about Peter. I feel like his story really comes to shine, and he's not someone who I think people, even people who are really sort of involved in the fashion industry would know that much about. He's not a voice that you hear, and I thought it was there's a real generosity, I think, when you watch that film, because it is celebrating that it's teamwork and it's collaboration. It's not just one individual. Was that quite important to Raf to show as well, that it's not just him, like the star designer?
Well, I think so. I mean, if you look at his creative process, it's all about collaboration and giving other people room to create. You know, he doesn't tell people what to do. He just tells them what he wants, the sort of a general feeling, a general concept, references, and then they go and they put their ideas into it. You know, that's what they explain when they explain their process, and that's what we recorded. You know, he doesn't sketch himself. He lets other people sketch. So there's always an interpretation that happens. You know, and then of course he edits at the end, and he decides what he likes, what he thinks makes sense for a show. But yeah, it's a very different way of creating, and I think it's also something that most modern designers have to deal with anyway, because when you have to create 8 collections a year, there's no way you're gonna sketch, you know, like 200 sketches for each collection. You know, it's just humanly not possible.
I imagine it was quite a different, not perhaps a challenge, but a different process for you as the filmmaker, though, because obviously the Vreeland film that I had to travel, it's so focused on kind of one individual and their life and their passions and their work, whereas this is very much about a group of people and their dynamic. That must have been quite a fun thing to work on, to kind of have that change.
Yeah. Well, it was totally different. I mean, this one was about life, sort of like happening now, and Diana Vreeland was all in the past, and all about archival footage and fantasy and, you know, like imagination. This one was much more grounded and much more, you know, vibrant, and, you know, I really lived through it, you know, in the way that maybe I didn't.
You must be very emotionally attached to that collection.
Yes, I mean, the other night I was telling Peter that I felt like I had made the collection with them, and he was laughing at me. He was like, "Really? You think so?"
He's like, "You don't understand how much work went into it."
But I think that's the feeling, though. I feel like you're so invested in what they're doing, and you've watched every single step of the process, and you've felt, you know, the same emotions of you. That's what I try to do. I try to like really have an empathy. And so at the end, you're totally drenched. And when the dresses go on the runway, you know, like I was in tears, basically, like when they were in tears also, you know, like it was,
Tell me a bit about them. Just, this is kind of like the housekeeping side of it, but I was interested watching the film about, were you literally there every single day, or did you have select days that you could go in? And
I was there pretty much every day. I mean, the French system is very regulated, so you have to take a 1-day rest after 6 days. Coming from working in the US, you know, I was very different. I was like, really, we can? So sometimes on the 7th day, I would just shoot by myself. Like when the first time they go to the venue
Yeah.
that they found, that Olivier is taking Raf, and Olivier called me and he's like, well, this might be interesting for the film if this venue pans out. And I was having lunch with a friend of mine in Paris, and I jumped in a cab, grabbed my camera, and just went by myself. I'm so glad I did. And there's no way I could, get my crew together.
Pivotal point in the film, that bit where they find that venue, I think.
I think so, because, Raf has an idea suddenly, and, it's sort of, it's crucial for what happens later. Yeah.
And tell me, was there any resistance? I imagine, we've talked a little bit about Raf kind of coming round to the notion of you being there and you filming, but was there any resistance from those within the atelier? Because they are so proud of their craft, and I think that's something that comes across, and it's really beautiful. But was there any resistance, even just to things like the way they make things being broadcast to the world? Because they're a secret.
I know, they were so happy to share it.
Really?
Yeah.
Nice.
They were like training me, basically. They were showing me the intricacy of, a lapel on a woman's jacket. In couture, they stitched what is called a picotage. So they do like millions of little stitches so that the lapel is not folded, it actually curls around. It makes a beautiful curve like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's incredible, and that's, of course, several hours of work for something that most people don't notice, but, the woman who wears it, I think,
does notice.
Yeah, does feel it.
Was there any rivalry with different departments trying to get different techniques into the film? So like, no, you have to show this bit, it's more impressive than this, or were they all quite
there were, I mean, you have two ateliers, so the tailoring and the dresses. And they're pretty much like separate worlds.
Yeah. I love the dynamic between those two women and the little relationship between Florence and Peter. That's my favourite.
Yeah, I know.
It's a real love story, that one.
Yeah, and I love Monique too. And they represented like two different side of change. Like I couldn't have asked for a better comedic duo in a way, because like one is very nervous, the other one is very like optimistic, happy-go-lucky, it was nice to have these two characters represent how you feel about change. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's scary.
I think that's one thing. It's interesting that you talk about that idea of change, because it is obviously it's very it's kind of an optimistic and celebratory documentary, but I think it is also like that you do see the difficult moments. Even just like, I love the scene where you see all their facial expressions when Raf first comes in, and you do sense this notion of kind of apprehension, perhaps not resistance, but apprehension.
Yeah.
And definitely kind of you see his emotional journey in the collection. Was that quite important to you, that it didn't just become a kind of glorified making of?
No, absolutely. I mean, it was very important that it was authentic to me, and also that it wasn't a caricature either, because I could have pulled all the sort of moments where people looked at their worst, and but I was not interested in that. I was interested in making a sort of three-dimensional portrait of every subject, and that's something that Raf told me at some point. He's like, don't make a caricature out of me, and he said, like often in documentaries, the filmmaker sort of latches on to like one trait of personality and reinforces it, and that's too bad. And I knew that. I've working on Valentino and working on Dan Averin, and that you have to, in order for the film to be sort of universal and to touch everyone, you have to make a human portrait that's hopeful, sad, just all these components, together. That's the only way you can make people sort of feel, for the character.
And is there an element also, like, I think I keep quoting you from past interviews, but you talked about this kind of notion of it being like Downton Abbey, because you talked about like upstairs, downstairs aspect, which I thought was...
It's actually the reverse, like the ateliers are upstairs.
I know, the Raf is... But I think it's an interesting notion, isn't it, that idea of showing the humanity, because I think fashion, not to sound critical, but fashion it's very much about polish, and it's very much about the final product and the final image, particularly because of the internet. And was it ever hard to get that balance right between doing something that, as you say, was very human, but not in any way kind of demystifying the world of couture? Because obviously, couture is driven by these amazing clients who like to have a very private world, and I think that relationship between client and an atelier is very sacred, and that must have been a bit of a challenge, just kind of to navigate the politics of that and not feel like you ever sort of that you were showing something but not kind of demystifying it in any way.
Right. I mean, I was not interested in the myth per se, like I was really sort of taking it from the other end, from the reality of the work. But I was interested, for example, in filming the clients. And Madame Rivière, who's the director of couture, said absolutely no.
No, they never speak. Yeah.
No, these women are very private. They don't do it for the publicity, and they will not be filmed, for anything. And so I respect that. And in retrospect, the film was not really about that. So it doesn't really matter.
But then there was an element. I thought one of the kind of crux moments in the films for me, it was that moment, and it is kind of a rare moment of real tension in the film, and you see Raf gets quite upset, and he does walk away from the camera, but you keep the audio, and he gets upset, and he's talking about I don't want to like spoil the film, but it is almost an argument about what should be the priority, the show and the kind of the creativity or the client, and the commercial side of the couture, and exactly, I felt like that was is that something that you noticed as a kind of a tension in any way?
Yeah, I mean, fashion is a commercial art. It's art and commerce, just like film. So I can totally relate to that. And I know that in filmmaking, there's always tension with between the producer and the director. It always happens. And the same goes for fashion. Any art form that's up for sale at some point or has money, attached to it, there's always going to be that tension. I think it's just legitimate, and I mean, but when we filmed that scene, we didn't really think about that. We just thought about sort of the point of view of Raf and the point of view of the seamstresses and the director of couture, and sort of it's more about control and taking control of the situation and asserting your voice. That was sort of the through line for us, is how Raf is on a journey of sort of finding his voice at Dior, because obviously it's intimidating. You step into the house that has such a big legacy, that has such a huge personnel, and it's just Raf, Peter, and Fulvio in front of all these people. So at some point they need to take control. So
it sounds like you feel a lot of similarities between your own practice and Raf.
Yeah,
and that feels like that's a story that kind of it comes through. It's interesting. Did you feel very close to him and kind of any struggles he had? They do seem to reflect things that you feel about your own work.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like, it's like Flaubert saying, Madame Bovary, c'est moi, it's like Raf, c'est moi.
Yeah.
But I feel like any creative person feels the same way when they work, whether it's in fiction or in documentary. You always try to express something through through the story that you're describing, but I think even in more general terms, that it's kind of like life, like you meet someone, they bring something out of you that you recognize as, and it's just the process of sort of human relationships.
We talked a lot about humanity, and there is another angle that I want to go down, which is also like in many ways, as much, it goes back to what you were saying at the start. As much as this is a film about people and emotions and Raf, it is also a film about Dior and an institution. And as you said, correctly, like Dior, it's such an institution, especially in France. Like it is kind of, you think Paris, you think fashion, you think Dior. And I'm interested because I know that you're particularly a big fan of films about institutions. Like you cited things like Crazy Horse as an inspiration. Was that also part of it? Was trying to tell all these individual stories, but also tell the story of this massive kind of like institution within France?
Yeah, I think it was very interesting to look at the building, the headquarters. This very tall, grand building, 5-6 story tall, and to see the different floors, and you could almost have a cross section of the building, and you see, and that would be a cross section of French society, you know, because in the same building you have the management team, the atelier, the creative directors and their team, and it's just a universe into itself. And it reminded me of this French novel by Balzac called Au Bonheur des Dames. I think the English is to These Ladies' Delight or something like that. It's about the first department store, you know, in the in the 19th century in Paris, and same thing. It follows like several characters, like from very different backgrounds. The little sales clerk who's just coming to Paris for the first time, and then the boss and the client, and it's an interesting way, I think, to talk about where society is. And if you look at the atelier, you see a reflection of French society.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. In some of the women, the way they speak about why they wanted to work there, you do get the sense that it is kind of like, it's the cream of the crop. It's where they would all aspire to be, and you get that sense of, I think, the relationship between kind of France and Dior comes through, I think, in how honoured they are to work there, which is quite lovely, isn't it?
Yeah.
I thought it kind of, as much as you humanise Raf, it is about humanising Dior as well in some ways. Right. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I think that's my process. That's what I strive to do, yeah.
And I have one question, which is, it's perhaps a tricky one, because I know that fashion isn't the only kind of area of filmmaking that you want to work in, but I wonder, I feel like we're seeing, obviously, you know, it's very fashionable to like fashion at the moment, and I feel like there's so much public interest in fashion, but we are seeing more and more of this kind of like, you know, behind the scenes has been a genre that's been around for a while, but kind of films about fashion, I think it all probably kicked off with the September issue, and then it's gone through. Do you think this is a genre that is going to just kind of grow and grow and grow, these kind of films about personalities in the fashion world and how it works?
Yes, probably. I think it's going to extend much beyond fashion, I think, actually. I mean, public image has become such an important part of our daily lives, you know, with Instagram, Twitter and all that. And of course, branding has become such an important part of business. So I think, I think it's going to become much more attractive for a lot of people to try to make a film about them, then, you know, successfully or not, depending on how they approach it.
Is there any kind of dream institution or person that you just want to kind of get under the skin or get behind the scenes of? I guess you've done Raf, you've kind of peaked now. So.
In the fashion world, no, I don't really have any other ideas, but any creative person, like I would love to do music documentaries, like something about Prince, you know, ever since I was 12, I've been a Prince fan, so for me it would be something to explore, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know.
I want to see that one. I'm staying tuned.
I'm not saying I'm making it, but I would love to.
You should do. Thank you so much. That was fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
No, it's a pleasure.